There we go. Okay, over to you, Mark.
Okay, very good. So as Paul said, we've had a team working very hard on this NHS project for quite some time now. The first phase was really about trying to defend the NHS from the government's Health and Care Bill as it was at the time, and now Health and Care Act. And what we changed our focus to probably about 6 months ago was to a more positive thing that said, instead of saying what shouldn't be happening, let's look at what should be happening, and therefore to take a more constructive view of things. This year, you may know, is the 75th anniversary of the NHS, and it's really struggling in this 75th anniversary year. So there is a big question for policymakers, obviously those in government, but perhaps more importantly, those who are not yet in government but might be thinking about what their policy should be, what to do. So we decided to produce something which we have tentatively called the Rational Policymakers Guides to the NHS. So I'll share my screen and talk you through it. So that should be that. So let me go to slideshow. So can you all see that?
Yes, Mark.
Slide. Okay, very good. So this is a project which, as the logos hint, is a joint project, actually. We started jointly between 99% and the National Health Action Party. More recently, we've had other organisations join, notably Keep Our NHS Public and Every Doctor, several patients groups, and also some other sort of more generally progressive but not healthcare specific groups like Open Britain and Take Back Britain. And what we've been working on is really to say, well, you know, the NHS is struggling now. If you were a rational policymaker and you wanted to act in the interests of the country, in the interests of its citizens, what would you do? And so that's essentially what our report, which is coming on, in, we've got a fairly good first draft of it now. That's what it's looking at. So if you were a rational policymaker, what would you do? Well, perhaps the first thing you would do would be to say, well, you know, what do other countries do? What works well? What doesn't work well? You might well start with international benchmarking just to see what the lie of the land is. And then you might say, well, okay, we've also heard that the NHS has been underfunded. Is that true? And if it is true, what's been the effect of that underfunding? And you might also say, well, you know, we are responsible, rational policymakers, so we're concerned about the long-term sustainability of whatever we do. So you probably try and look at that as well. So let's do that. Let's have a quick look at those three questions. So what does international benchmarking tell us? Well, luckily, we don't have to do all our own benchmarking. There are some established benchmarks. In particular, the Commonwealth Fund has been for many years, probably the leading international benchmark of healthcare systems, and they have done reports. We've looked at all of them since 2010, and here is the results from their, well, the report was published in 2014, but the data actually relate to the years from 2010 up to about 2013. So it's a picture from the early 2010s. And what you can see is they benchmark 11 developed countries and their healthcare systems. You can see there's a very, very clear number one, which is the NHS. And you can see it's the second column on the right. It's actually not just number one overall, which is the top line, but it's number one in almost every category as well. And if you look along the bottom line at how much it costs per person, you can see that it's an extremely efficient system as well. Efficiency is one of the measures that they look at, so you could say there's a tiny bit of double counting in looking at that, but you can see it's a very clear picture. The UK is the global benchmark in that year. There's also another standout one, which is the number 11 out of the 11, which is the US system, which has actually come out number 11 on quite a few of the individual items, as well as being number 11 overall, and is dramatically more expensive. So the first thing you take from the international benchmarking was that there is a sort of clear number one, or at least there was at that point in time, and there's also a very clear number 11. But that is a snapshot, so it's worth just looking at how that changed over time. So here you can see the average of their scores. This is their overall ranking in the years before 2020 and in all the years, including the latest report, which was 2021. And so what you see is a very interesting picture. The UK has slipped, and you can see the difference between the two bars on the left. You can also see that the USA has held on to its position as by far the worst healthcare system in the developed world over that time. So if we think about why that is, and that's of course particularly relevant to this question of what a rational policymaker would do, what is it, if you were a rational policymaker and you were trying to look after the interests of your citizens, what would you be looking at? And in essence, you would want a healthcare system that works, that actually produces decent outcomes. So that we've called effectiveness. You would want a healthcare system which was efficient, because citizens are also taxpayers and they have to pay for it. So you would want an efficient system as well as an effective one. And you would want a system which was equitable, which treated people based on their health rather than based on their wealth. And the UK, the NHS naturally scores very well on two of those three. It naturally scores very well on equity because it's free at the point of use. If I'm ill, they don't ask to see my finances or to see my credit card. I go into hospital and they treat me. And that is that is the most equitable system. So it naturally tends to score very well in every single year on equity. It also scores very well on efficiency because the NHS, a lot of people complain about the fact that it's a monolith, but it has enormous economies of scale, and it uses its buying power very effectively. So the same drugs in the UK cost about 40% of what they would cost in the States, because they have, although they have, you would say they should have much more buying power, but it's all fragmented. So they end up paying much more for the drugs than we do. So we naturally score very well on equity and on efficiency. And that means that if we can also score reasonably well on effectiveness, then we come out best overall. So that's the picture. That's again based on the 2014 report, and you can see that the UK is the standout high performer because it combines those three things. And what that means is that if we get back to the point where our effectiveness is all right again, then it's very likely that the NHS will be the best overall because it naturally scores well on efficiency and equity. So if you're a rational policymaker, you'd probably take that as your starting point and say, well, shouldn't we be aiming, given that on 2 out of 3 of these axes, we are likely to score well, and we do want to be effective, we should really be aiming to be best overall again. So that's the first question. What does the international benchmarking show? Effectively, it shows that the NHS is the global gold standard in terms of models of how to do healthcare. The second question was, what's been the impact of underfunding? So here we've got, what's that, 7 countries benchmarked there. The Financial Times did a benchmark with a larger number, but it showed exactly the same pattern. So the red line is the UK, and what you can see is that our spending per person was rising reasonably fast and beginning to catch up until 2009, I suppose, was beginning to catch up with our peer countries. But whereas other people have continued to spend a gradually increasing proportion of GDP on healthcare, our spend has been declining up until 2019 as a percentage of GDP. And that has had profound effects. So the government says, well, we're putting all this money in, but actually that's only true if you're prepared to ignore the fact that there's a lot of inflation, that the population grows, that the population ages, and we have increasing rates of morbidity in the population. We have rapid increases in things like obesity and diabetes and mental illness, in hypertension and so on, all of which increases the workload. And you can easily correct for some of those. So if you ignore all of them, then it looks as though we've been continuing to spend, but just not at quite the same sort of rate. But once you take out inflation, and then you take out the growth in the population, and then you take out the aging of the population, you see it's basically static. We're trying to get a fourth line onto the bottom here to show what happens when you take out the increased morbidity. And that's an incredibly difficult thing. Nobody's got that information ready to hand, but we're hoping we might be able to add that fourth line on before we finish this report. But you can see that even without that line, we've stopped increasing our expenditure on healthcare. We stopped in 2009. So what impact did that have? Well, it had quite a stark impact. These graphs are all from the Financial Times. There was an excellent article a couple of months ago looking at the impact of this. So this is the impact on waiting lists. So you can see that waiting lists had been declining during that period when we were growing the spend, but they've really shot up now. Even if you ignore the COVID bit, it doesn't really change the picture. The waiting lists have shot up. The percentage of people attending accident and emergency who are seen within 4 hours has plummeted. And again, you can see that predates COVID. The number of avoidable deaths per 100,000, we have, over that period, really left the band, which was our peer countries, and we have more avoidable deaths per 100,000 people. And life expectancy at birth is reducing faster than almost all our peer countries. So you can see a very clear correlation there between the underfunding and the performance. So again, if you were a rational policymaker, you'd be saying, okay, so the business model looks pretty solid. I can see the impact of the underfunding. So it's tempting for me to say, well, maybe I should just fund it properly, but I'm still worried about long-term sustainability. So before I sort of commit to what I might do, I need to think about long-term sustainability. So we have looked at that as well. And what we've found is basically this picture. So current GDP is just about 2.2 trillion. So that's about here. What will it be in 50 years' time? Well, obviously that depends on a lot of things, but if we assume that the current very low rates of productivity growth continue, then if we don't fund the NHS, we could actually completely collapse the economy. We could end up with a smaller economy in 50 years than we have today, which is an unthinkable performance, but that could be the impact. And the reason for that is that there's one obvious and a couple of slightly less obvious connections between healthcare spending and the economy. The obvious one is that if you spend more, you get better outcomes. We saw that if you spend less, you get worse outcomes. Conversely, if you spend more, you get better outcomes. So if you do continue to spend less, you will have more and more people dropping out of the workforce. And we have had record numbers of people dropping out of the workforce. And if that continues, it further reduces your ability to grow the economy. And if you're fixing your spend as a percentage of GDP, then if the economy isn't growing, then your spend on healthcare doesn't grow. So you never get out of that vicious circle. So that's the obvious one. The slightly less obvious ones are that if you start going down this route, it makes it harder also to invest in prevention, which is very, very cost effective, and of course prevents people from getting ill in the first place. So again, has a very beneficial effect on the economy. And thirdly, poverty. So Michael Marmot has done a lot of work showing the scarily large impact of poverty on health, so that people in the most deprived parts of the UK get much more ill than people in the least deprived parts, and they die many years earlier, and they have far fewer years of healthy life. So all of that feeds into this picture, which basically says, we should be looking at something of the order of doubling the size of the economy over a 50-year period. But if we carry on down this path, we will, with current policies, we'll be somewhere in this range from no growth at all to maybe 50% growth. So it's an enormous economic catastrophe, quite apart from the moral and healthcare catastrophe that this implies. So that's it essentially says, if we let the NHS fail, if we let our healthcare system fail, then we will be letting our economy fail with it. And the final question that we wanted to look at is, well, if we didn't do that, if we said, well, let's adjust NHS expenditure to meet demand, what would happen? Would it race away? And the answer is, well, actually, it would for a little while, because we've got a 7 million backlog of people needing healthcare. And so we've got significant undercapacity today, plus a backlog. So we would need to spend quite a lot more until we've cleared the backlog. But then after that, gradually, we would see a declining percentage back down. So this is total healthcare spend. So about 3/4 of that is NHS spend. So we would get down to under 10%, around about 9% of GDP going into the NHS over time. So politicians would have to be quite brave, because, but this happened last time. This is what happened under the last Labour government. We had a big spike, but if we then don't try to come down on this, we don't try to come down on a sharp trajectory, we just keep the capacity to match demand, it will gradually decline as the economy grows. So that is our conclusion. So the answer to the question we started with, how would a rational policymaker approach the crisis? Well, they would say, okay, it does look as though the NHS model is the gold standard. We clearly can't afford to continue to underfund it, so we need to fund it properly. That doesn't mean to say that there's nothing else that can be done to fine-tune its performance, but what it does mean is that any shift to take the worst possible case, the US model, which is the one that the current government seems very keen on, would be an absolute disaster. So a rational policymaker would be committing to restoring the NHS to its #1 position. So that is a very quick summary of the arguments that we're putting forward in this new report.
Fantastic, Mark. Thank you. It's really compelling. Comments, questions? I'm sure there'll be lots. Who wants to go first? Maybe I'll just start with one people are thinking. Mark, you mentioned the Commonwealth Fund.
Yes.
As the benchmark you use. Are there alternative benchmarks which paint a different picture?
I don't think so. We have looked. There are alternative data sources, but they don't do as much processing as the Commonwealth Fund does. The Commonwealth Fund actually gets its information from sources like the World Health Organization and the OECD health stats. So you can go directly there, but then of course you end up with the same kind of picture. Groups like the King's Fund and the Nuffield Trust, Commonwealth Fund is US-based. In the UK, we have the King's Fund and the Nuffield Trust, which do benchmarking, but quite a lot of the time they are citing the Commonwealth Fund data. So as far as I'm aware, there isn't a reputable source painting a very different picture.
Okay, thank you. Hannah, you had a question?
I was only going to add to what Mark was saying about benchmarking. There are other benchmarking systems like the RAND Corporation. There's a European health index as well. And they all tend to say what the Commonwealth Fund has said.
Okay.
So there's one organisation that looks at Europe but on very different parameters with different standards. But in terms of the standards that the Commonwealth Fund uses, practically every other benchmarking organisation that includes the UK tends to use very, very similar benchmarking and comes up with the same results.
Okay, so it'd be very hard to challenge your work on the basis of the international benchmarking. That would be, people would agree with that. The analysis that you arrived to come to the conclusions on the impact on the economy, how clear-cut is that, Mark? Are there many assumptions that have to be made along the way, or is it?
There are, of course, lots and lots of assumptions. Yeah. And there's a very critical assumption that we haven't tried to model. The biggest single driver of how big the economy will be in 50 years' time is productivity growth. Mm-hmm. And that is something which is actually not currently understood. The UK has very, very poor productivity growth, and economists are still arguing with each other about why that is. So we had a choice either to try to model that, which would mean doing something that no other economist has managed to do yet, or instead of that to say, well, let us simply take two extremes. One is that it never gets much better than it is today, and the other one is that we do get back to the kinds of levels of productivity growth we had before the global financial crisis, which were vastly better. So what we've done is scenario modeling rather than attempting to do a prediction of what the economy would be. So the chart I showed you was based on the more pessimistic scenario. The reason for that was twofold. One is that in some ways it's probably better to do it on the more pessimistic scenario. The other one is that the OECD has some long-term economic forecasts. Whether they're worth anything is another question, but they have got them. And using the pessimistic scenario gives us an output which is roughly in line with those long-term OECD forecasts. If we assume, so we have modeled this, if we assume that the productivity growth gets back, which is about doubling from what it is today, gets back to what it used to be before the global financial crisis, then of course all the numbers look vastly better. And actually, so it's a rising tide which lifts all boats. It makes all the policy options look better, even the ones which are about constraining the funding of the NHS, simply because your population doesn't necessarily change, your GDP is shooting up, and so you're even with a fixed or declining spend, you're getting closer to meeting demand. But what it doesn't do is to change the relative order of which policy option looks better. So you're still better to adjust NHS demand in line with need, even in the more optimistic scenario.
Okay, thank you. Questions from others? Mike, go ahead.
Yes, a couple of naive questions, if you'll allow.
Of course.
One is, how much difference that makes to the figures when one allows for health service inflation rather than general domestic inflation, or is that already baked in?
Well, no, that's a very good question. So, and there's a sort of implied assumption, which is true, that health service demand grows faster than normal inflation, and that is true for three reasons. It's true, or two reasons. No, three reasons. It's true for three reasons. One is the population is growing, so that means that your demand is bound to grow simply because you've got more people. Secondly, it's not growing evenly across all age groups.
Yeah.
Actually, if you look at the cost of healthcare, I'll simplify and sort of exaggerate to make it clear, but very, very simply, up until you're about 75, you're not very expensive. After you're 75, you become extremely expensive. Of course, it's not quite as simple as that. But what that means is if you've got an aging population, which we have got, then you will naturally have growth on top of the cost of the population growth. You'll have a cost of the population aging. And then the third thing is if you have a population which even within an age group is becoming less healthy. So let's say, you take 40 to 50-year-olds, that's a fixed age group. But if obesity is rising a lot, or rates of mental illness are rising a lot within that age group, that's a third factor layered on top. So you have got an increase of demand, which is driven by those three factors.
Yes, and there's of course technological and scientific advances which render treatable things which hitherto were untreatable. And
well, yes, I mean that's slightly different because in the UK we have this institution called NICE, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, and what that essentially does is to say if you develop a new drug which is fantastic, you've actually got to prove that it's fantastic before we will put it into the British National Formulary. And it's not just drugs, it's other things as well. So you will have to show that there's a business case for it. So if there's a business case for it, then actually that means it should be helping with the affordability of the treatment rather than hindering it. So technology should be one of the factors that helps. If it's out of control, it would not help. But while you have something like NICE acting effectively, then it should help.
Thank you. My second question is slightly broader. I presume we're making assumptions about the extent and quality of the growth which is forecast in the economy and the underlying income which is therefore available to the National Health Service. Is it reasonable to take a critical view of that and say, and again, this is shorthand, and like you, I'm exaggerating to make my point, that we actually have a Ponzi scheme economy, which is based upon chucking money at, designed to increase asset values, because our economy is so precariously based upon, say, for example, house prices, which are probably double what they really ought to be in relation to average incomes, that now we have this great big pile of a problem, political, economic and otherwise, and we're just assuming that we can get away with this ad infinitum. And so therefore the fate of our public services has been put in jeopardy as a consequence of political and economic decisions, which are now so heavily baked in that really there is no, it's death or glory, really. Is that a reasonable thought process, or is, again, that just fanciful?
Well, I think it's, I don't quite agree that things are baked in irrevocably. I always think that policies can change. So I agree with the first half of what you said, which is we have had very, very poor economic management basically since 2010, and that means the economy is unbalanced. Is in some ways, I think it is acting a bit like a Ponzi scheme, etc. So there are very big issues about the overall economy, but we have tried not to get into that in this report, because what we've tried to do, and what I tried to show you, was an argument which is in essence pretty simple. Because if we don't make an argument which is in essence pretty simple, then the policymakers won't understand it. So we've tried to steer away from arguments which were purely economic. We've got some appendices to the report which stray a little bit outside the scope of what I talked about. But really, we're trying to focus on this very simple argument. And the reason is that we thought, if we can just get some people to wake up and think, well, hang on, why are we talking about all this, bringing in expertise from the US and getting US corporate healthcare corporations to help us out? Why are we talking about that? These 3 points, the benchmarking, the underfunding, and the sustainability, all point to the idea that that's about the worst thing we could possibly do. If we can just focus policymakers on those 3 simple points, then we think we've got more chance of persuading them than if we try to tackle all the other points that you've mentioned, even though you've raised some very powerful points.
Thank you very much.
Questions from others?
I just, excuse me, I just had one. I mean, I think I've not really been involved with this project at all. And I think as an outsider, I was fairly aware of the issue of benchmarking and efficiency and outcomes and so on and so forth. I also, but I was aware of a narrative, a popular narrative, that the impact the economy has on the affordability of the NHS. I hadn't seen it the other way around, of the impact that the NHS can have on the affordability of the economy. Now that's something which I can see nodding heads on the screen as well. This is something that was very new to me. So my question is anybody else talking about it in these terms? Is this part of a general narrative that's just under the radar, or
well, I would say
is this an exclusive?
Yes and no to that. So there have in the last 6 months perhaps been several other reports which have hinted at these same, well, at that particular point. So the NHS Confederation did a report, I think, just before Christmas, which looked at the return on spending extra money on the NHS, and essentially what they said was, every time you spend a pound on the NHS, it's worth £4 to the economy. And more recently, the King's Fund have done something which has said something similar. What they haven't done is to think of it in terms of a sustained policy over many years. And so, if you say, well, we won't spend so much this year and it will hurt the economy a bit, it doesn't sound very bad. Oh yes, Vicky's pointed out the IPPR report this week is also saying the same thing. So it's an argument which people are starting to hint at, But what they haven't done, I didn't really go into what we've done because I didn't want to make it too complicated. But what we've done is to build something called a system dynamics model, which is a model of the interaction between healthcare and the economy over time, because we wanted to look at this sustainability question. And if you don't look over time, you can't answer the question about sustainability. So that's the bit that we've done, which is different. And that makes the argument more powerful, because a bad policy becomes a disaster over 50 years. It just isn't quite so clever over 2 years. So by looking over that long time frame, we're showing what a disaster it would be.
Hannah, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I don't think I've come across any other powerful argument which reverses the NHS economy NHS thing than Mark's. I mean, I think Mark has produced some really original and powerful looking through the correct end of the telescope, if you like, rather than the government or mini government's narrative telescope. And I think I haven't come across anything else in terms of Mark's model and how effective and powerful it is anywhere. I've not seen anything.
Okay, thank you. John, go ahead.
Oh, you're on mute, John.
There's an Irish economist called Dexter Whitfield, who has been working for the trade union for some time, and he produced in 2018 good evidence of the multiplier effect in the Northwest, NHS in the Northwest, which complements what Mark was saying about the 4-to-1 ratio. But because he did the whole Northwest, it became a very powerful argument, because the human element was there. More people were employed in the NHS than were NHS employees. There were small businesses that took up the NHS. There was a huge multiplier effect, and this is a very, very powerful argument. He made it in 2018. He made it again in 2020, and in a backhanded way, he, working with the University of Woolwich, made the same case around PFIs. So it's out there, because there's some very good evidence out there.
Okay, thank you, John. So Mark, the report will be ready for publication when? So sometime over the summer?
Yes, so I mentioned at the beginning that it's the 75th anniversary of the NHS. And the celebrations are planned for early July. So we are planning to have a big launch, and with our partner organisations to try to make as much of a splash about this as we can. What we are hoping to be able to do is to get some MPs who are sufficiently motivated that they will host an event in the Houses of Parliament. And we're also hoping that we can get some celebrities involved in it to mean that the press come along as well, and therefore that we create a splash with it. As we've said, we're trying to make the argument very clear, simple and punchy, so that it doesn't just sort of get lost in with the technical arguments that have been very good, that a lot of other people have done, but it gets a bit, it actually changes the nature of the discussion. That's our objective, to change the nature of the discussion.
Sue, go ahead.
Might it be possible for us to share the report with MPs we have connections with?
I think
ahead of July.
Well, the answer is yes, with care. The report isn't quite finished. It's probably got some mistakes. It's now reached a length where it's difficult to manage. When we started writing it, it was 10 pages long, so it was easy. But it's about a 60-page report now with lots of appendices and so on. So checking it and getting it all right and making sure. I found two different versions of the same graph in it today when I was just looking through. All that sort of thing is more difficult. So we would have to be sharing it with people we could really trust.
Particularly, Mark.
Sorry, say that.
Sorry, particularly, Mark, when it comes to the launch, I mean, everybody here presumably could help just by writing to their MP to say,
absolutely,
report you want to take a look at.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
but I was thinking that Sue meant, can we share it now? And the answer is, if we're very, very careful, yes, we can. But we have to be very, very careful because it has to be somebody that we can trust with a report that isn't finished, and that they understand that they're receiving it in confidence. So, for example, we're hoping to get Sir Michael Marmot to write the forward for the report. I've shared the draft report with him, but that's because I trust him. I know exactly what his position is on these issues, as does pretty well everybody in the country. And I know that he will be supportive. I wouldn't send it to somebody that I think might be supportive, but I don't really know them and trust them.
So can you talk a bit more, Mark, about the process leading up to the launch and how we could help? I mean, for example, if members were asked to try and contact their MPs 2-3 weeks ahead of the launch with a final copy of the report, I mean,
yes. So there are various ways that people can help. So we have got a team of people who volunteered who are actually doing the work on the report itself. And we're also reaching out to various external experts who, because you raised this point about the assumptions in the model, the morbidity question is one which it's very hard to get anybody to admit to being an expert in. So I thought this is going to be easy now that I can talk to Sir Michael Marmot. But as very often with academics, he said, no, you see, that's not exactly my area of expertise. So it's surprising how often it happens, but it happens a lot. So finding somebody who will sort of put their name, or at least even if not put their name to it, say, yeah, I think these are the right assumptions on morbidity, has proven so far to be quite difficult. But there are other things that people can help with, as you say. Finding out if they have got MPs who are in principle supportive to this. That's something people could start to do today, to reach out to them and see if they are in principle supportive. If anybody knows any suitable celebrities, people like Stephen Fry or Carol Vorderman, or if anybody has an in to any celebrity who they know is supportive. Joe Brand made a sort of impassioned plea for the NHS a couple of days ago, but unfortunately I don't know her and I don't know a way in. And it is it's quite difficult to get to celebrities because everybody, the nature of being a celebrity, I don't know from personal experience, but I have come to understand is that you're inundated with requests for this, that, and the other, and therefore they all go through your agent, but your agent is remunerated. They get 15% of what you get. So for the agent to say whether this is going to be interesting to you, actually part of the decision making is, well, is this going to be revenue generating for the agent? So if you have a direct, warm relationship with any celebrities, that's more likely to be effective than if we go via their agents. Yeah. So that's another thing. And similarly with journalists, if you know any journalists that you think, well, this one is likely to be very supportive, we would be very happy to be talking to them in the weeks leading up to it. So those are all things that people could help with, or might be able to help with over the coming weeks.
Yeah, Hannah, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think, I'm only making a suggestion, but would it be a good idea to have a standard letter, whatever, that we all, or whatever, send like on the same day. So if it's people's
There's a bit of background noise from somewhere. If everybody's can go on mute who's not speaking. Hannah, go ahead.
Sorry, I just think it's really, I've been thinking about this today actually, post our meeting this morning, that having a standard message, we should all be saying the same thing, using the same words, possibly. I'm only suggesting this.
Yeah. So I think that's right. So Shirin has got a sort of one-page summary of what the project is all about, which I think we're going to update it, but that's available to anybody who can't quite remember what I said, but
apparently it's not punchy enough, so I've been tasked to make it more punchy.
Oh dear.
Yes.
I do think it's important that we hit our message hard in a big, all singing off the same hymn sheet. I hate that expression, but I think we need to do it in stages. But I do think we all ought to be saying the same.
yes, agree.
On the same day. That is only a suggestion. I just feel we ought to have a form of words that is authorized, or whatever the expression is, so we're all saying the same thing.
And it just makes it easier, Hannah, to do as well if people are given the words to use. John?
It's coincidental that in 1998, Dr. Don Berwick, who was, first of all, the health advisor to Tony Blair, and he's an American, and he's run a not-for-profit health organization in the States. He's also very highly regarded in the health industry in the state, the right kind of health industry in the States. He's very well regarded here as well. And he made a famous speech called NHS at 75 years. So in other words, he made the speech when the NHS had turned 50, and he projected forward what it would be like when it turned 75. And that's what the date we're talking about is.
It is, yes, absolutely.
And so one of the things that maybe we could think about is getting Don Berwick to actually say, what the hell? This is not what I thought it would look like in 1975. It's 2075 or whatever, or when it was 75.
Yeah.
So I think he would be a big ally. He's a very big fan of the NHS. He's got very good influences, and he's got a very good hand on the politicians. He knows them all. So is there anyone in the group who knows Don at all, or has any information about him?
I don't know him at all. Do you know him?
Well, I think it'd be worth working on that. And the other person is Professor Alison Pollock of Newcastle. So if you wish, I mean, Pollock, she was the first person to go onto TED Talks and talk about the NHS and the privatization about 15, 16 years ago. And she's a very strong opponent of what the government has been doing and has a lot of influence. Do we have? I know quite a lot about her. I do know who I communicate with her over statistics. So if you want, I can sort of talk to her about what you're doing.
Yes, please.
In a kind of a consultative way, and ask for her help.
Yes,
would that make sense?
Brilliant. That would be brilliant, John. Thank you.
Okay, and she might find a way to Don Berwick again.
Yes. Yeah. Very good.
Okay. I need to leave in about 10 minutes, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Other thoughts on the publicising of the report? So I quite like Hannah's idea of a coordinated launch around the same date of writing to as many MPs as we possibly can can. So I guess, Mark Shirin, it's a matter of talking to as many members as possible ahead of that to say, please be prepared to write your MP around this sort of date with the report. We'll have the report for you.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Sangeeta. Bye-bye.
Yes, thank you, Sangeeta. Yeah.
I mean, we've leapt into the sort of the publicisation process, but any other questions that people had on the report itself? Go ahead. Go ahead, Meryl.
Oh, yeah, it was on the Alison Pollock comment. Not only she's written, and I'm public health by background, not only has she written extensively on deprivation and health, but she's probably a good starting point for trying to get somebody who might be supportive around the morbidity issue, because that might and she's very bright and she's very nice. And I think that if you can get hold of her, John, I think that would be brilliant.
Okay.
Yes, fantastic.
Okay. Any further questions or comments? Marcus, Sharon, anything else you want to add on the path ahead?
Well, really just to thank the team that has been working on it so hard and has got us to this point. Actually, it's I think it's coming together as a very impressive report now. It's a bit frightening that it's reached this size, but that was inevitable, I suppose.
And it's lovely to have all these people who are giving us their time and energy and commitment and for the love of the NHS. So it's wonderful working with them. Thank you.
I've not been involved at all, so I can say it's really a deeply impressive piece of work. And it deserves to be widely publicised. So I'm sure everybody will do as much as they can to assist with that.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mark, Sharon. Everybody else has been involved in this. We'll wrap it up here and we'll hear more about the launch process, I guess, next time.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
Brilliant.
thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Good to see you all again.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.